So let me just say, I attended graduate school in the go-go 80s when the god of theory overthrew all the other gods and conquered and ate all the fathers, mothers, and everything else in its way. But I was fortunate to have attended the University of Dallas, where we still read texts. And so before going off to graduate school, I had a really good grounding in what's now called the new criticism. And whatever I'm going to say goes after this. I want you to know that I love to read texts, and I want my students to read poems, and I want them to read them as imaginative wholes created by a mind to convey truth and wisdom to us. But I did somewhere along the way, some of the theory stuff rubbed off, and I began to read Wayne Booth, who made me question the new critic's intentional fallacy, and really the God that emerged, right, was some form of a kind of a postmodern new historicism, and I really, having also been, exposed to good teaching of history at the University of Dallas, I began to really enjoy reading texts in historical contexts, and it seemed to be the responsible thing to do. And as I became a medievalist, there was no other way to read text, right, from a time of such alterity, but then to learn something about intellectual history, social history, and all those things, and apply those to the texts that we read. So I just wanted to give you kind of an example of how I do that, but how I do that not in a way to simply read the text historically, but to help my students then return to the texts as imaginative creations. And it seems to me that Beowulf was one of the best examples of how to do that. So I just want to tell you that so what I first do is take the students through the text, right? And we read about that grand opening and the hymn to shield chafing as a god Kinnig, right? About the building of Heorot and then the threat to Heorot that Grendel brings on, and the coming of Beowulf and the killing of Grendel and Grendel's mother, and then on to the slaying of the dragon. And I think that's the way you should teach the text, is especially at younger ages, right, is to get the students into that amazing drama of the hero and the hero battling these evils. Now, at the college level, taught by Roland Lassiter, I then go back and take them through the interpolated stories, right? All of those stories that the Shope tells or that Beowulf tells when he gets back. And those are really the texture of the poem. Those are the amazing moments that begin to offer us a way to think about and critique the heroic action, but also to set that heroic action against, frankly, the interminable conflict that often that the poet sees happening on the human level in the political life that he's describing. So once students are familiar with that main narrative of the poem, though, what I like to do is take them back through the reception history of the poem. I like to take them back through how the poem has existed in history and how it has been read differently and responded to differently in history. So the first thing I love to do is just show them the manuscript. Students love to see medieval manuscripts, and just show them that this is the manuscript, Cotton Vitellius A15, that it was written down somewhere around the year 1000, and we know that, right, because of the script, because of the dialect, and all of that. Even though scholars debate vigorously whether the poem was composed around 1000 or much earlier. The earliest dates is usually around about 600, but there is a good case to be made for every date in between. Kevin Kiernan is one of the few to believe that the poem was actually composed as late as around 1000 and written down almost right away. Most scholars believe it was composed orally and performed orally, probably quite widely, before it was written down by its two monastic scribes. There's two different hands. One takes us all the way through Beowulf killing Grendel and Grendel's mother and then returning home. And then the poem, there is a break 2/3 of the way through, and another hand picks up, copying the last third and the battle with the dragon. But as I say, everyone debates in between. And of course, what that gets involved in is the nature of the poem that everybody's interested in. How pagan is it? How Christian is it? Right? The early great editor, Kleber, talked about the Christian coloring How much is that just Christian coloring sprinkled on top of what was originally seen as a pagan poem? How much is the Christianity actually, embedded thoroughly throughout the poem? Those things come into debate, and in fact, there become kind of circular debates. If you assume the poem was originally pagan, then you tend to pick an earlier date. If you assume the poem is shot through with a Christian sensibility, you tend to pick a later date, although those can come up for debate as well. And the students are fascinated by that history and realize that there are things at stake. But the other fascinating thing about the reception history of Beowulf is that, right, because of William the Conqueror coming through, and that the poem is essentially lost to the rest of literary history for most of the history that we think of as, all right, the history of English literature. None of these writers knew Beowulf. Chaucer did not know Beowulf. The Gowan poet did not know Beowulf. Shakespeare did not know Beowulf. Sidney, Spencer, Johnson, Donne, Herbert, Marvell, Crashell, right? Swift, Pope, Dr. Johnson, none of these knew Beowulf, right? The poem was sitting in a library. We only can trace it, actually, from about 1563, when a guy named Christopher Noel signs his name in it and dates his name. But from the year 1000 to 1563, we really have no idea where the poem was. And no one knew about it. And this one guy came through and signed his name in it, whether that was him, saying, I was here or I own this manuscript, we actually don't know. We do know that sometime during his life, we don't know when during his life, but those are his life dates, it enters the library of Sir Robert Cotton, one of the great antiquarian collectors of the Renaissance, who had a massive library and he collected this. By the way, he also collected the manuscript of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. And there are only a single copies of each of those manuscripts. So it enters the library of Sir Robert Cotton at some point. That's when he actually records it. Oh, by the way, to return, students love hearing this. I don't know if you know this. It's called Cotton Vitellius, Cotton for his name, and it's called Vitellius A15 because his library was organized with a set of bookshelves, and at the top of each shelf was a bust of a different Roman emperor. And so you would go to the bookshelf with Vitellius's bust up there, go to the first row, A, count in 15 books, and that's where you find, right, the Beowulf manuscript. The Gowan manuscript is Cotton Nero A14, I believe. I may have the number wrong. So what a great way to organize your library, isn't that great? Somewhere around 1705, 41 lines were transcribed. And then in 1731, there was a fire at the Ashburnham House right as the whole collection was about to be transferred to the new British Library. And it did damage the edges of the Beowulf manuscript. Many manuscripts were destroyed. It did damage the image, the edges of it, and that's why those 40 lines being transcribed help us know, at least for those 41 lines, the last word, because many of the last words, if they didn't get burned then, they began to crumble and fall away. Then there was a fellow named Gunnar Thorkelin, who's a great hero in Beowulf studies, who has a copyist come and make an entire transcription of the manuscript in 1787. And then he is the first to edit the manuscript. Why is that not doing that? In 1815. And he provides a Latin transcription of it. And this is really the first complete edition we have. So again, no one knows about it. It's just sitting in the library. No one knows this manuscript. No one knows anything about it and until this Icelander, comes along. Now, why is he there? Why does he have the thing copied? He is working for the government of Denmark, and he's been sent around to find Danish poems, find old Danish stuff. Why is he doing that? He's convinced, right, since it is set in Denmark, that it was originally a Danish poem. Not an Anglo-Saxon poem at all. He's great. He's convinced that it is a Danish poem. It makes a certain amount of sense. The main action takes place in Denmark and a little bit in Sweden when Beowulf goes home, right? Why is he so interested in it? The simple thing we heard about already, right? 19th century nationalism. And he's been sent there on a sort of mission to go find Danish stuff so that we can have good Danish stuff to support, right, the efforts of Danish nationalism, right? What happens, right, is that then English scholars say, well, wait a minute, it's written in Anglo-Saxon, so that's actually our poem. And the British Empire being a little grander than the Danish Empire at this time, and the English scholars begin to take it over, right? And the English are thinking in very strong ways, right, about their own artistic heritage, right? The French have their chanson, right? The Germans have their own great poem. The Greeks and Romans have their epics, right? Then, by goodness, we need one of them epics. I suppose you should say that, right, with an upper crust British. Hey, we should have one of those rather longish poems. But I'm from Mississippi, so I say, we need one of them epics, right? And that is, we're looking for an origin story, right, at the time of sort of the greatest, as we're moving into the greatest extent of the English Empire. And as a great empire, we need one of those things. We need a fundamental origin story, right? And it falls perfectly in place. And thank you, Mr. Icelander, working for the Danish government, for finding the thing that we needed. And it falls exactly into a historical narrative to suit the historical political needs of the British Empire at this very time. Which gives me a short occasion, because I think I'm doing okay on time, to tell my favorite Irish joke. Since I am of Irish as well as English descent, why does the sun never set on the British Empire? Because not even God trusts them in the dark. Okay. The story then turns into, right, what does happen with the 19th century reception. It's edited and published several times over the course of the 19th century, but remains a kind of largely scholarly text. And the criticism of the poem then, right, begins to borrow from, well, what do we do with really old texts? Well, the biblical scholars at this very time were developing a method for dealing with that text, right? We treat it like an archaeological dig. And in the same way that we need to find the Elohist and the Yahwist and Deuteronomic authors, right, we're going to take this poem that does seem to have these different kinds of things. It has a main story, but also has all these other funny little stories embedded into it that don't always make narrative sense with that story. So it must be the same sort of a thing. And so the 19th century scholarship of the poem borrows, right, the biblical historical method to begin to sort of detect layers to the poem. And there must be a Danish layer, and there must be a Swedish layer, there must be all of these different things. And then somewhere along the lines, right, it traveled its way to England and added an Anglo-Saxon layer. And so that's the way the criticism of the poem was treated all the way through. By the end of the century, it begins to enter, shall we say, the more popular canon, definitely the educational canon. I had a student who found an early publication of the Modern Language Association in 1885, where the president of Princeton suggests requiring Anglo-Saxon literature, and especially Beowulf, over that namby-pamby Greek stuff. And this very much is a turn at the end of the century, to a kind of Germanic sort of movement, cultural movement. It's absolutely a turn against that sort of effeminate Greek stuff towards the manly, forceful Germanic stuff. And the Princeton president wants his young men studying that stuff. And he makes no bones about it. The real great shift in the criticism comes with the fellow that everybody at this conference knows about and loves, right? Tolkien translated the poem and finished his translation in 1926, but actually didn't publish it at the time. It's only his son that publishes that translation after his death. But of course, as so many people here know, Tolkien has Beowulf on the brain for the rest of his life, and it is, right, the most fundamental thing. But he gives first a talk and then publishes an essay that changes everything in Beowulf criticism, called Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics in 1936. And in this, he looks at that criticism of the 19th century and says, we're doing this all wrong. That what if we changed our attitude and treated it like a poem? Like, right, the effort of an individual artistic mind who, right, wanted to create an artistic whole and weave together all of these stories and was responsible, therefore, as a mind for an artistic whole with a particular artistic meaning. And that's what we should be doing and reading. That is very much like the new critics were doing in Vanderbilt at the time, right, to reimagine literature on this basis, basically like a Kantian basis of an integrative artistic whole. And that changes everything. And really, since then, that has been the fundamental way that people have read Beowulf. And even through all of the changes of the time. The next big shift comes with this guy, with a novel by John Gardner called Grendel. And this was in 1971. I don't know, how many people have read Grendel? Oh, only a couple. So there was a time when everybody would have raised their hand. It's a slim novel that Gardner was having fun with, and right where he creates the entire novel as a dramatic monologue told from the point of view of the monster. And it's really fun. I just reread it just for the heck of it for this piece, and creates a great deal of sympathy for the monster. It's very difficult not to, right, in a first-person monologue, but creates a kind of past for Grendel, creates a relationship with his mother, and envisions him as seeing the great building of Heorot, imagining what's happening with that. He has some admiration for the men, but he also has a kind of cynicism about their acts of heroism. What we really get is a kind of 1971 Vietnam attitude towards the building of Heorot, towards the sort of efforts of men and their heroism. He goes and visits the dragon very early in the novel. The dragon spouts 20th century existentialist philosophy and psychology to him, and he goes to him because he's been attracted by the beauty of the Shope songs, and he feels himself being drawn to that beauty of the Shope songs, and the dragon obliterates that and teaches him nihilism, basically, that life has no meaning, that he should not be, and that's when he begins his murderous rages against them. And therefore, right, there is this sort of critique of the heroic, because he sees the men as just fighting border wars and building it. It actually didn't have a great deal of effect on the scholar critics who study the poem. They'll find it interesting. We've all read it at some point, but it didn't really shape ours. What it did change is the popular imagination of the poem. And you find more and more people who were shaped by that history. And right around this time, Beowulf begins to enter popular culture in fascinating ways. It always sort of been there, but it really begins to enter in interesting ways. There's the poem Beowulf and Grendel. I don't know if anybody has seen The 13th Warrior. It begins to make its way into films. It gets into comic books. I love this one. I always shock my sons when I say I never read comic books. My friends read comic books when I was a kid, but I love this. It may be hard to see this. Beowulf, Dragon Slayer. So what Beowulf begins to be imagined is only as a guy who slays dragons, and here he's saving the slave maid of Satan, which gives her a chance to wear a skimpy outfit, I suppose. But Beowulf begins to emerge in popular culture. And of course, as I said, there's films right around the turn of the millennium, right around the year, some of these are from the very end of the 90s and into the 2000s. And then we get the Zemeckis travesty, Please raise your hand if you've seen this one. Okay, it's, ooh. It was a motion capture, totally motion capture CGI film. Just as creepy as the earlier one that they did with the Polar Express, which has terrified children who love the book for years. It's creepy and bad, but it's bad in all sorts of ways. Angelina Jolie did her motion capture work, and then they covered her in gold. You'll notice she not only has the great braided hair, I didn't get this in it, but she has a tail that ends in a point, and she's in high heels that are also gold. They use CGI to computer enhance her hips, so she'd be a little hippier than she is. The fascinating thing that they do with the narrative is that after killing Grendel, Beowulf goes down into her lair and confronts Beowulf's mother. But what we find is that she offers him, if he will sleep with her, she offers him wealth and fame beyond his possible imaginings. The film then has Beowulf return to Heorot, where he lies that he has actually killed Grendel's mother, and then meets Hrothgar's eyes across the room. And Hrothgar, played by Sir Anthony Hopkins, kind of gives the little nod that Brian is giving to me right now, and we are to see very immediately that Hrothgar made the exact same deal with Grendel's mother earlier, and that is what has led to Hrothgar's wealth and fame and the building of Heorot. It's the most astonishingly cynical reading of the poem that you can imagine. There's Beowulf staring at Angelina Jolie, I can't ever call her Grendel's mother, at the crucial moment of his seduction. Now, at the end of the film, after the CGI battle with the dragon, strangely enough, in a completely atextual moment, Angelina Jolie emerges from the waters, and Wiglaf, shoot, I didn't catch that. Wiglaf is there, and they lock eyes. So we're to see that this is to continue, that Wiglaf is going to make the exact same deal with Angelina Jolie that Hrothgar and Beowulf made as well. By the way, if you're interested in any of this, this is a friend of mine, Ed Risden, who's a marvelous Anglo-Saxon scholar, with Nicholas Haydock, whom I don't know, who've written a whole book on the different adaptations of Beowulf on film. So it is just this astonishingly cynical notion. And we see how far we've come. And it does come through, right, sort of this gardener first imagining of a sympathy with the monster, and then sort of a reworking, therefore, of a kind of attitude towards the hero. Now, Gardner didn't intend this. I mean, it's pretty clear if you read the novel, and I think a lot of popular misreadings of the novel are really bad, that we're supposed to be sucked in, and Gardner had the attitude of the dragon, basically, of a sort of existentialist nihilism. It's really clear when you read the novel that Gardner is writing a kind of a via negativa, and in the final confrontation with Beowulf in the novel, we're to see that we're there. So what I just want to draw this back to is to say that after taking the students through this, they actually are appalled at the film. And they actually want to go back to the text. And they really want to see a poem as articulating a notion of the heroic. And if you go to the last lines of the poem, this is in Liutz's translation, this is the very last lines of the poem, right? As they're lamenting Beowulf as his death, they said that he was, of all the kings of the world, the mildest of men and the most gentle, the kindest to his folk, and the most eager for fame. That last phrase is tied up in one Anglo-Saxon word, lofviernost. And it's really fascinating because in the criticism, this is a crucial crux. How do we read that last word? Is that a good thing that Beowulf was eager for fame, or is it a negative thing? It's very clear in the poem that in battling the dragon and losing, Beowulf is bringing about the end of his people, because all of the other tribes and peoples are now are going to be poised, and all of the Yeots know that they are toast upon Beowulf's death. So was it a good thing that he was eager for fame or not? And I think this has a lot to do with, do we appreciate what is a pagan value of being most eager for fame, lof, or is there a Christian ironic critique of that possibly in the poem? And what's fun is the students really now care about interpreting that word. The students really care about reading that word as the conclusion of the whole that is the artistic whole of the poem. And so my sense is that by moving, in a sense, out of the text into the reception of the text and then coming back to the text, my students are now deeply invested in the very thing that I want them to be deeply invested in, which is reading a poetic text as an imagination of a whole, to have something to say to us about the wisdom of pursuing fame. Thank you very much.